Always glad to welcome back Frank Gaffney, the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy. Frank, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Lars. Great to be with you.
What do you think we're going to see from New York's finest, Senator Chuck Schumer, in the weeks ahead?
My guess is we're going to see a man on the horns of a dilemma, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. Yeah. I think he's being severely beaten up by the hard left in his caucus in the Congress and all the people outside of it who claim that they have to work for them on basically an anti-American agenda, I'm sorry to say. They are excoriating him for having collapsed in this failed shutdown of his and having failed thus far to bring in, as the Center for American Progress put it, George Soros-funded think tank that is kind of the chief ideologue for the Democrats these days. They need more illegal immigrants in order to ensure that they have a majority of the electorate who will preserve them, get them into power, and then keep them there permanently. So he's got that going against him. But the thing that ultimately caused the shutdown to crater, the Schumer shutdown, that is, to crater, of course, was that there were quite a number of Democrats up for re-election in states Donald Trump carried in 2016 who are nervous as cats that they're going to be held responsible for what Schumer was perpetrating, which is this, help the illegal aliens at the expense of the Americans. And they decided they'd had enough of it, and lo and behold, he was left holding the bag. So I think it won't be pretty to watch. I think he'll be doing a lot of thrashing and threatening and otherwise trying to sabotage President Trump. But hopefully it'll have the kind of relatively happy ending that the shutdown did. Namely, I think these guys have to run with their tails between their legs.
You know, Frank, did you happen to see within the last few hours the latest move that Schumer has made with regard to the border wall?
I have not, other than I heard something about how he's withdrawn the funding for it.
He reneged on it, and he acted as though, this is the thing I was just telling my audience about, that the White House said to build that wall we need a commitment of $18 billion. I'm reasonably sure that's not all in 1 year, but give the commitment and put it into the law. And Schumer's reply, this big deal. In fact, Frank, I listen to both sides. I mean, I listen to liberal radio. I listen to taxpayer-funded radio. And this morning they were doing an interview with a gentleman who was from the administration, and they said, "Well, but Chuck offered, or Senator Schumer offered the whole deal," and he said, "No, he didn't. They offered $1.6 billion in funding, which is less than 10% of what the White House said was necessary." And I think most reasonable observers would look at a wall like that and say, if we're going to have a wall to cover another 12 or 1,500 miles, whatever it takes, and we'll take advantage of the natural barriers there of mountains and rivers and all that it's going to cost $20 billion. But that's a small investment for a country when you think of it as a permanent investment. I mean, if you buy, if you go to the Pentagon, you spend money on tanks and planes and battleships and aircraft carriers. Those are, by their very nature, somewhat temporary in that, when a ship or a Humvee or a tank gets to be a certain age, you retire it, or it costs you a lot of money to keep it in service. A wall, heck, China's got a wall that's been there for a whole long time, and we could have a wall that's there for a whole long time, and it would be a good piece of permanent border control so that even if situations change down the line, there's always ways to let people through a wall. I have a gate in the fence at my house, and most people do. So when they say $1.6 billion, Schumer acted as though, well, we gave him everything. He withdrew the offer today. He said, I'm taking that back. Well, he's taking back a tiny, tiny slice of the entire pie that was requested, as though, I offered to give them, what they wanted. No, you didn't. You offered them 8% of it, knowing that I'm sure he plans that the midterms will go differently in the elections this fall, and that the Democrats will have additional control in the next 2 years of the Trump administration, and they'll probably say, oh, now we're not going to fund any more. That's the game they're playing, right?
Yep. Well, absolutely. And as I say, I think that withdrawal of a position that he had taken just days ago was a product of what I was just talking about, Lars, the fact that he was getting the daylights kicked out of him by the left. But you're right. And let me just add one other point. I mean, China's wall is ancient history, literally. The wall that the Israelis built, they call it a border fence or security fence.
Most of it is fence.
It's a wall.
I've seen it. Well, yeah, it's a barrier.
There
right?
are parts that is a concrete wall. And I would just say the difference that has made in the security of the people of Israel, who not so long ago, you'll remember this, perhaps some of your audience will, not so long ago, they were suffering practically daily terrorist attacks.
Yep.
And they were simply because they had no means of keeping those folks out.
Well, and
they do now, and the attacks have stopped.
Frank, to put a punctuation point on it, they told me we took a helicopter tour of that wall over 10 years ago, and we also drove along it and could see it. Most of it is fence. The places where they have wall, they explained to me, were the places where Palestinians would sit on the top of apartment buildings on one side, and they would shoot people and murder people. There were also instances where they said a terrorist would get in a cab with either a bomb on him or guns on him and have the cab take him to a Jewish celebration on the other side of the line, on the other side of the border, and he would walk into a hotel and either blow himself up or murder a bunch of people. And they said, we can't let this happen anymore, so they put up a barricade. And it's been very effective. They told me more than 95% effective in stopping terrorist attacks. They dropped like a rock as soon as that barrier was up. And it took them.
And how do you assign a value to that, Lars? And this is your point. The value that we would get from not having further infusions of illegal aliens who will all demand amnesty in due course, make no mistake about it, further infusions of drug traffickers, at least, vast supplies of drugs coming in. Hezbollah was bringing in tons of cocaine, for heaven's sakes, when the Obama administration wouldn't stop them because they didn't want to interfere with the Iran deal. This is a real national and homeland security threat. It has to be addressed. This is clearly part of it. And I hope the president and the Republicans in Congress have now found their footing on this and will understand that the American people, there's a new poll out from Harvard, I think, that says overwhelmingly the American people support the kinds of principled stand that Donald Trump has taken to protect our borders and ensure that we are not afflicted by further terrorists, further drug traffickers, further human smugglers, further illegal aliens, and the diseases that they bring in, and on and on and on. It's an eminently sensible thing, and I say to Chuck Schumer, bring it on, pal.
Yeah, well, he's clearly in trouble when his own base, I'm sure, is screaming at him. How dare you give them the wall? And I'll tell you, Frank, he at least makes the case that he made that promise last fall. I have audio tape from him from Sunday, in which he said, I offered the president the wall last fall. Well, what he offered him was this tiny little slice, as though a slice might whet the president's appetite, and he'd suddenly turn into the worst negotiator in the world, when in fact we know he's one of the best negotiators in the world. Frank, thanks so much for the time, and thanks for what you do at the Center for Security Policy.